So welcome to everyone, and thanks for coming to this year's first community medical school, fall 2018. I can't believe the summer's over already. I'm Beth Kirkpatrick. I'm here to do the introductions. I'm a professor and chairperson of the Department of Microbiology and Molecular Genetics, and I serve as the director of the UVM Vaccine Testing Center. So tonight it's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Benjamin Lee. Dr. Lee has been here at UVM for approximately 3 years. He arrived here in 2015 after finishing his final training in the specialty of pediatric infectious diseases. Dr. Lee received his undergraduate degree in biology at Amherst. He did his medical degree as MD from Case Western in Cleveland, performed pediatric training at his residency at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and then finished this quadrifecta of training at Pittsburgh, at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh. And in addition to his clinical training, Dr. Lee has brought to UVM a real wealth of training in medical research, and he continues this work now, which applies to the health of children throughout the world. His research skills started with clinical coordinating, and then he was an NIH Fogarty Fellow in Thailand, where he studied HIV. And then he polished off his research training with basic and translational training in Pittsburgh. Currently, he works on improving and understanding why vaccines do and don't work well in children in the developing world, particularly in the field of rotavirus vaccine, which maybe he'll come back and tell you about next time. But for tonight, we're talking about influenza, and Dr. Lee's talk is entitled All About the Flu, the Virus, and the Vaccine, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Lee.
All right, can everyone hear me okay? All right, thank you very much for that nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all here this evening. To kick things off for the first community medical school, we thought it would be fun to talk about something that hopefully ends up on everybody's mind at some point.
Louder.
Louder? All right, let me do a couple of things. Let me move the mic closer and turn the volume up. How's that? Is that better? All right, thank you. So we're going to talk about influenza tonight, something that is a topic that comes up fairly frequently. I have nothing to disclose. What's so funny? I have nothing to disclose, and here are the goals that I've set out for this talk. We're going to spend the bulk of this session talking about the virus itself. So we're going to touch on aspects of influenza virology, epidemiology, some clinical aspects, and then a discussion about pandemic versus seasonal influenza. And that will form the majority of the session, but then I'd also like to spend some time towards the end talking specifically about influenza vaccines and vaccination. So what are the benefits? What are the current limitations? What does the landscape look like now? And where can we go from here? So first, let's start things off by talking about the virus itself. So what is influenza? Influenza is a single-stranded RNA virus. That means its genetic blueprint, rather than existing in the form of DNA, which is what we have, is in the form of RNA. And influenza is unique in that it has what's called a segmented genome. So all the genetic material exists in these eight separate segments, and that will become important for reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later. The virus itself generally has this simple structure where the outer surface contains two important proteins. The first is called hemagglutinin, or HA, and the second is neuraminidase, or NA. And this is where we get the H and the N types from when we're talking about influenza. And for humans, there are two main types that we talk about. There's influenza A and influenza B. Okay. And the way that scientists refer to the different forms of influenza is quite complicated, but the simplest way to talk about the nomenclature for influenza A viruses is specifically to look at the H and the N types. So it's now believed that there are 18 different forms of hemagglutinin, H1 through H18, and 11 different forms of neuraminidase, N1 through N11. And so when we put those two together, that's how we generally refer to the common subtypes of influenza. So for example, many of you may have heard about the H1N1 flu. That's the type 1 hemagglutinin with the type 1 neuraminidase. Influenza B viruses are a little bit different. They tend to have not nearly the same diversity of proteins on the outer surface, and we generally refer to influenza B viruses according to what's known as the influenza virus lineage. And there are two major lineages of influenza B viruses. The first is called Yamagata, and the second is called Victoria. And there are reasons that we think that influenza A tends to be more diverse. One of the most important reasons is that it's known to be able to affect a wider array of different animal species than influenza B. Okay. So what does the flu do? This is something that we're all familiar with. It's influenza. At the end of the day, the reason we worry about it is it causes seasonal respiratory infection and illness. This is what causes the flu every winter. And the symptoms are quite nonspecific. Generally, we expect to see a lot of fever, a lot of headache, a lot of cough and sore throat. It's more common in children, but nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea can be seen, and a lot of muscle aches and a lot of fatigue. So this is when we think about when you catch the flu, these are the symptoms that we generally think about. They're fairly nonspecific. There are lots of other viral infections that can cause a similar picture, but there are some clues that can help you determine whether this is actually the flu or, say, the common cold. So the cold, for example, usually comes on a bit more gradually. You just don't feel right one day, and then the next day you feel a little bit worse, and then the next day a little bit worse. Influenza usually will hit you like a ton of bricks. You think you're feeling well, and then all of a sudden, boom, what just happened? Usually we tend to see a lot more fever and muscle aches with influenza than the common cold, and a lot more headache and cough. The common cold, we tend to think more of upper respiratory symptoms, so cough, congestion, sneezing, that sort of thing. But there generally does tend to be a much more severe presentation and manifestation when we're talking about influenza compared to the common cold. Okay. And this is a big, big problem. One of the things that I find remarkable when speaking with people about flu is very often people will underestimate the true public health burden of influenza. So if we look at estimates from the World Health Organization, every single year, the World Health Organization estimates that 1 billion people, that's billion with a B, will be infected with influenza every single year. Fortunately, only a minority of those infections will go on to lead to severe illness, about 5 million cases per year of severe illness. And of those severe cases, on average, depending on the year, about 500,000 people will die of influenza. So again, I think that's worth repeating. Every single year, about 500,000 people are going to die of the flu. And I like to put this into a slightly different context when talking about these numbers. So just as a quick show of hands, who here has ever heard of Ebola? Right? Everybody here heard about what was going on with the Ebola outbreak in 2014, 2015. So let's compare the numbers that we see with seasonal influenza to the numbers that we saw with the 2014, 2015 Ebola outbreak. During the West Africa Ebola outbreak, we had a little less than 30,000 cases and a little more than 11,000 deaths. Now, certainly, what we call the case fatality ratio was high for Ebola. So if you caught Ebola, then that was bad news because the risk of dying was much higher. But let's just put these numbers side by side. During the entirety of this Ebola outbreak, which deservedly got a lot of attention, about 11,000 people died. Every single year, about 500,000 people are going to die of the flu. Okay? So I think that the true public health burden of influenza still sometimes goes underappreciated, and sometimes I like to frame it in this context to sort of impress upon people the numbers that we're actually talking about. If we want to look a little bit closer to home, here this is just data from the United States now. Anywhere from 10 to 30 million cases, 140 to 710,000 hospitalizations, and depending on the season, 12,000 to 56,000 deaths per year. So again, every single winter, tens of thousands of people in the United States are going to die of the flu. Okay. Fortunately, the majority of people who get the flu will recover from it, and we usually expect people to start getting better, usually within a week, sometimes two. Excuse me. And people are usually contagious for most of that time. So contagiousness, people are usually contagious starting about a day before they start really feeling their symptoms, through about 1 week after they start their illness. And the degree of contagiousness usually does tend to correlate with the degree of fever. So if you have the flu and you have a fever, you are spreading it to anybody who gets near you. Once the fever goes away, the risk of that does tend to go down somewhat, although not entirely until usually at least a week or two later. The problem is that a minority of patients will go on to have severe complications of the flu. And the challenge is that we're still not very good at predicting who those patients are going to be. Who is the person who's going to catch the flu and then end up in the hospital with a life-threatening complication versus the person who's going to feel miserable for a few days but then sort of be back on their way. We do know that there are certain populations that are considered high risk for influenza. So young children, particularly those less than 2 years of age, adults 65 years of age and older, pregnant women, people who live in nursing homes or long-term care facilities, Native American and Alaska Natives. And there's a long list of underlying health conditions that can place people at higher risk as well. Some of the most common are asthma or other underlying health lung diseases, such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, people with significant underlying heart disease, any form of neurologic condition, a weakened immune system, or cancer, and morbid obesity. These are all known to be higher risk populations. And when we talk about complications, there are a number of different things that we can expect to see affecting multiple different organ systems. So the neurologic system can be involved, the heart and the circulatory system. We definitely know that pregnant women and their fetuses are at significantly increased risk, and lots of muscle aches and muscle damage can be seen with certain strains of influenza. But the one I want to spend a little bit more time talking about tonight at a couple of different points during our session are respiratory complications. When we really worry about somebody who's going to get really sick with flu, the thing that one of the things that we worry about most is whether or not the influenza has led to pneumonia. And that can come in a couple of different flavors. The flu itself can cause pneumonia, but perhaps even more worrisome is when in the setting of influenza, a bacteria is able to get down into the lungs and cause a bacterial pneumonia. This is known as secondary bacterial pneumonia when it occurs in the context of the flu, and this can be highly lethal, even in young and otherwise healthy patients. So this is a chest x-ray of a child I took care of several years back who in fact had this exact complication. So he had the flu, and then a bacteria called Staph aureus was able to get down into the lungs and cause a rip-roaring pneumonia. And this is now, in medicine, this is one of the most classic associations we see in, when it comes to clinical infectious diseases. If somebody has the flu, right then they're at a much higher risk for catching pneumonia due to either Streptococcus pneumoniae, that's the classic bacteria that causes pneumonia in both kids and adults, but the one that's different is Staph aureus. This bacteria usually does not cause pneumonia. It only really happens when somebody also has the flu, and when you get staph and pneumonia in combination, that can be a lethal combination. Okay. And so this brings me to the first of several myths that I would like to try to dispel during the course of the session. So the myth that healthy people are not at risk for complications from influenza. There are a lot of people, generally healthy adults, who sort of have the "I'll just tough it out" approach, thinking that I'm generally healthy. If I do get the flu, I'll feel lousy for a little bit, but probably no big deal. This is a myth because the young and the healthy are at risk for catching secondary bacterial pneumonia when they catch the flu. So being young and healthy, and looking at all people in the room here, college-age kids, young adults, being young and healthy does not get you off the hook. You can absolutely have serious complications from the flu, even if you're young and healthy. Okay. When we look at the leading causes of mortality in the United States, one other fun fact that I like to point out is when we go down the list, the first type of infectious disease that appears on this list is influenza and pneumonia. So when we talk about infectious causes of death in the United States, lower respiratory tract infections, so pneumonia is number one, and that is headlined by influenza. So once again, I just want to point these data out to impress upon everybody what a serious health burden influenza is. Okay. So these, I'm going to show a couple of tables now from a clinical study that was performed during the beginning of the 2009 H1N1 epidemic. What I want to point out is, once again, I'm just hammering home a theme here, is that during the H1N1 epidemic, at the start of the epidemic, all of us doctors I mean, expected that the people we were going to see pouring into the hospitals were going to be the very young, the babies, and the very old, the elderly. In fact, what happened with H1N1 was the exact opposite, and this caught all of us by surprise. The people who were being admitted to the hospital in greatest proportion were the 18 to 49-year-olds, the college-age kids, and the healthy young adults. And this really sort of turned everything upside down, because it's hard to impress upon people now what a shock that was to the health system. But this was really unexpected, and there are a lot of lessons that we've learned from that pandemic that we apply going forwards, one of which is the theme that I've been discussing, is that everybody is at risk from complications from influenza, not just those who are elderly or otherwise or have underlying health conditions. Okay. Same thing, same study. What I'd like to point out here is that if you split up all the people who survived and did not need to go to an ICU in one category, and in another category put all the people who needed to be admitted to the intensive care unit or died in the hospital. One of the most striking differences was how many more people who died or needed the intensive care unit had pneumonia. So this is just another, this is direct evidence during the H1N1 pandemic that shows that pneumonia is dangerous when it occurs in the context of influenza. Okay. So different study, but same idea. Just another way of showing that during the pandemic, it was relatively young and healthy adults who were having the greatest mortality during that pandemic. Okay, so the last few slides I've been talking about the 2009 pandemic. So let's go into pandemic versus seasonal influenza in a little bit more detail. So first, what is a pandemic? So a pandemic is defined by the World Health Organization as the worldwide spread of a new disease. When we talk about influenza pandemics are caused specifically when we get a brand new subtype of influenza A that appears in the human population that has never been seen before. Fortunately, those occurrences are relatively rare. Most of the flu that we see occurs in the context of seasonal epidemics. So an epidemic is the occurrence of more cases of disease than expected in a given area or among a specific group of people over a particular period of time. So this is what we see every winter when flu season rolls around, and all of a sudden we see a huge spike in the number of people who are coming in with the flu. That's our seasonal epidemic. That happens every winter. Global pandemics are rare. And if we look at the history of pandemic influenza over the last 100 years, we see that there in fact have only been 4 true global influenza pandemics. The granddaddy of all pandemics was the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. This was an H1N1 influenza A. And after each pandemic, what you'll notice is that variations of that strain are what tend to sort of circulate in the global community following the pandemic until a brand new one emerges on the scene. So the next pandemic occurred in 1957. This was an H2N2 influenza. Next, in 1968, there was an H3N2 influenza pandemic. This was the so-called Hong Kong influenza pandemic. And then, for whatever reason, we had a relatively quiet period where we didn't have any pandemics until 2009 H1N1 hit. So fortunately, pandemics are rare, but when they occur, they really can be global catastrophes. So I want to talk a little bit about the Spanish flu pandemic. So this is one that everybody has heard of. 1918, 50 to 100 million deaths is the current estimate. That represents about 5% of the world's population died that year during the flu pandemic. The case fatality rate for the Spanish flu pandemic was about 100-fold higher than normal. So basically what that means is that strain of flu basically killed people 100 times with 100 times greater efficiency than other strains of flu that had come before it. Okay. So why was it that the Spanish flu was so deadly? At the end of the day, we probably will never get a complete answer, but there are a number of things that we think really facilitated this. So it really was a convergence of a perfect storm of a number of different factors. So this was World War I, and during that time period, we had mass movements of vulnerable populations all across the globe. So you had lots of people heavily concentrated in specific regions of the world that then were suddenly moving to other regions of the world very rapidly. So this is a perfect scenario where a new pathogen might be able to spread quickly throughout the world. Lots of people to infect and lots of people moving to all corners of the globe. And that's exactly what happened. In the context of this, a new pandemic, influenza A strain, emerged. And not only did we have a new strain, but this ended up being quite a deadly strain. So why it exactly killed so efficiently, again, is still not completely clear. It's felt that there were a couple of different likely causes. So sometimes what happens when somebody is confronted with a new infection is the immune system, in a certain sense, overreacts. It just goes haywire. And when that happens, sometimes this is referred to as a cytokine storm. The body gets so revved up trying to fight off what's going on, it doesn't realize that it reaches a certain point where it's actually doing more damage to the body than good. And we believe that this phenomenon was occurring at a very high rate in the Spanish flu pandemic. And it's also now understood that during that pandemic, there was a lot of pneumonia that happened as well. So it's now estimated that probably up to 90% of all the people who died during that pandemic died because they got a secondary bacterial pneumonia on top of the initial influenza infection. And I put this public service announcement up here. This was from the 1918 pandemic, from the Rochester Health Bureau. I love it because really nothing has changed in terms of what we advise people about influenza. So begins suddenly with headache, chilly sensations, and fever. That looks like the list that I went over earlier. When uncomplicated, it's not a serious disease. Fever goes down in 2 or 3 days, right? The majority of people are just going to feel crummy for a little bit, but then get over it. But if fever persists or returns, it probably means a most serious pneumonia. So that's exactly what we worry about today. People don't get better or suddenly get worse after it appears that they've been getting better, then that's a surefire sign that a pneumonia is now involved. Okay. So we've talked about a new pandemic strain emerging. So how does that actually happen? All right. So when it comes to pandemic influenza strains, there are 2 ways that we can end up with brand new strains of flu that the world has never seen before. And we'll talk about both of them briefly. So the first is direct animal to human transmission of a new strain. And the second is a process known as gene reassortment. So the first is based on the understanding that influenza affects multiple other animal species, not just people. So in particular for influenza A virus, it's believed that the major reservoir for influenza A is birds, specifically water birds, both wild and domestic, but also domestic poultry as well. So when we talk about avian influenza or bird flu, this is where that comes from. We know that birds carry it and can spread flu. In addition to birds, multiple other mammalian species can be affected, most importantly, pigs or swine, which is where we get the term swine flu from, but also any number of other mammals, including, which I just think is really fun, which I don't know why, but seals and whales. So I've never had a thought of a whale sneezing before I learned this fact, but that's definitely, it's definitely known that a lot of marine mammals can be infected and spread influenza as well. And so usually what happens in the general circumstance is that flu viruses that infect birds like to stay in birds, viruses that infect pigs like to stay in pigs, viruses that infect humans like to stay in humans. This is a phenomenon that we see with lots of different pathogens. It's called host range restriction. Every once in a while, what we can see happen is that a swine flu, say for example, or a bird flu will generate a mutation or an adaptation that then allows that virus to make a jump from pig to human or from bird to human. If that occurs, and whatever mutations occurred also allow this human then to spread efficiently human to human, that's when we can see a new pandemic strain emerge. And in fact, it's believed that this is exactly what happened with the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. That was an H1N1 subtype of influenza, and it was believed that, that this occurred due to a transmission event from birds developing some type of adaptation that allowed this H1N1 virus to jump into humans and then spread like wildfire throughout the human population. So that's one example of pandemic strain emergence. The second is this phenomenon called gene reassortment. So I mentioned earlier that influenza has a segmented genome where all the different pieces of RNA occur in 8 different segments. What this allows is it allows the opportunity for mixing and matching and swapping of genetic material. So if you have an organism, say a human, chicken, pig, whatever, that just by chance is infected at the same time with 2 different strains of influenza, within the host cell, now you have multiple different gene segments to choose from. So what you can see is the virus that leaves the cell now has a completely different genetic makeup than either of the 2 viruses that entered the cell. Okay? And when this happens, this also provides a rich opportunity for a brand new strain of virus to emerge that the world has really never seen before. The way I have young kids, so I think of everything in the context of things that I see my kids do. So this is like when you take your kid to a play date with a box of Legos. When you come back home, you look in the Lego box, everything looks different. You recognize your Legos, but there's been a lot of mixing and matching that occurred at the play date. Right? The same thing can happen inside a cell when it comes to gene segments of influenza virus. And this is in fact what happened with the 1957 and the 1968 flu pandemics. We believe those viruses originated due to reassortment events with, from avian flu strains reassorting with human flu strains to give a brand new virus each time. What I love about this figure that I'm showing you guys right now was that this was written in 2005. This was before the 2009 pandemic. So back then, they were asking, where's the next pandemic going to come from? And what I love is, back then in the mid-2000s, everybody was guessing that the next pandemic was going to come, once again, from some type of avian influenza. It's a reasonable assumption because the 3 previous pandemics that century had all been basically generated by avian influenza. So that's where everybody's attention was. In fact, we all got surprised. The 2009 H1N1 pandemic originated in swine. And we believe that that flu was a result of 3 separate reassortment events. It's called a triple reassortant virus. So what happened was, first, you had a pig virus that reassorted with an avian influenza. This virus, this combination virus, then had a separate reassortment event with a human strain of influenza to give you this intermediate virus. And then finally, this virus had a 3rd reassortment event with a completely different swine influenza, yielding a triple reassortant virus. So this virus ultimately was carrying genetic material from 4 different previous influenza strains, now in a brand new combination. Brand new influenza virus that the world really hadn't seen before. And that's where we got the 2009 H1N1 pandemic from. Okay. So the question still stands now. We have one pandemic in our relative recent past. Where will the next one come from? Really, at the end of the day, it's anybody's guess. But there are reasons to be nervous about certain areas, particularly birds in Asia. So these poultry farms in Asia have tremendous concentrations of birds, and these are all located next to tremendously large population centers. And so we already know that in a lot of these domestic poultry populations, there are a number of new viruses that circulate from time to time amongst them. This is where you hear those news stories every once in a while that said the Chinese government ordered the slaughter of 20 million chickens. You know, it's because one of these viruses has started to pop up and is circulating amongst the birds, and they're trying to get a handle on it before it has an opportunity to develop the ability to jump into the human population. But fortunately, these events are rare, because in order for a virus to cause a new pandemic, it has to be an antigenically new, so meaning it has to have a completely new combination of proteins at the, on the surface of the virus that humans hadn't seen before. But the other kicker is all of those changes have to allow it to pass easily from person to person. And thus far, this has been our saving grace. That transition from being able to pass efficiently between birds or between pigs, being able to do the same thing in humans for those viruses that originate in birds or pigs, that ends up being a much harder trick to pull off. In many ways, that's sort of a saving grace, is even if we have lots of new viruses, very few of them ever develop the ability to be transmitted efficiently from person to person. So there are a number of viruses that public health authorities sort of are nervously keeping their eye on. The H5N1 strains and H7N9 strains of avian flu in Asia are one example. The H3N2 variant influenza is one example closer to home. So influenza viruses that normally affect swine that manage to infect humans, those are also called variant influenzas. And every summer, we see a number of H3N2 variant influenzas infect people in the Midwest. These generally occur for people in agricultural fairs who are around a high concentration of pigs. Every once in a while, we'll get handfuls of reports of this happening in the American Midwest as well. And at the end of the day, when we talk about predicting pandemic influenza, I'm always reminded of two of my all-time favorite scientific quotes. So the first one is the recognition that Mother Nature is a mad scientist and life finds a way. So definitely, despite all of our technical advances and our scientific knowledge, at the end of the day, it's probably just as likely we're going to get completely caught by surprise, just like we were with the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. Okay. So pandemics are uncertain. We don't know when they're going to come. We don't know how they're going to appear. But there are a number of things that we do know are certain in life. So if I were to ask you, what are the things that are absolutely certain in life? What's the classic answer? Death and taxes. Beautiful. The only things that are certain in life are death and taxes. I would add a third one to the list: death, taxes, and seasonal influenza. Right? So we talk about pandemic influenza because they're big, scary events, but they're rare. But what is not rare, this is going back to the data that I showed earlier, what is not rare is seasonal influenza. This should never be a surprise to us. Every single winter, this happens. We should be used to this by now. We should expect this, and we should know what's coming. And the reason that we see a yearly influenza epidemic is somewhat related to the reasons that we see pandemics, but there are some differences. So the emergence of pandemic influenza strains, so brand new strains of influenza that we've never seen before, the process of that is something that scientists refer to as antigenic shift. So an antigen is basically just a protein on the virus that the human immune system recognizes and tries to attack. That's an antigen. What happens with these pandemic strains, as we've been reviewing, is that the composition of those proteins, due to all these genetic changes, is completely different. So it's something that the human body, the human immune system has really never seen before. That's antigenic shift. This is rare and doesn't happen very frequently. 4 times in the last 100 years this has happened. However, influenza viruses do something else known as antigenic drift. In antigenic drift, what happens is that these same surface proteins, the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, the H and the N proteins, every year they're, or constantly they're undergoing just sort of a low-grade mutation. They're just very subtly, constantly changing themselves as time goes on. And what ends up happening is by the time a year has passed, the virus that's circulating this year looks different enough from the virus that was circulating the year before that people who even had the flu the year before can now suddenly get reinfected with this new strain of influenza. This is why we see flu every single winter, is because of this process. We know that flu is going to be a problem for everybody. One of the ways that I like to picture it in my mind is, think about if you're in a boat on a river, just drifting. If you're paying close attention, you can see that you're moving. But if you decide to lay your head back and take a snooze, even if you're moving really slowly, when you wake up and take a look around, you're going to be in a completely different place. You might recognize you're in the same river, but you're in a completely different place and you may not quite know how you got there. That's sort of how I view the immune system interacting with antigenic drift. Things are now different, and the immune system, in a sense, is lost. Excuse me. The reason that we see this phenomenon happening has to do with the fact that influenza is an RNA virus. So the genetic blueprint, the instructions, are encoded in RNA, not DNA. The difference is that in DNA, the overarching goal of DNA replication, so when our cells are dividing and trying to make 2 copies of themselves, the overarching goal is don't make a mistake. When you replicate, when your cell divides, at the end of the day, the most important thing is that no mistakes get made. When a mistake gets made, for example, that's how cancers can arise. So for DNA replication, the goal is no mistakes. For RNA replication, it's in many senses the complete opposite. When RNA replicates itself and makes a new strand of RNA, in fact, errors are extraordinarily common. And it's estimated that for influenza, given the length of all the genetic material in an influenza virus, the error rate of RNA replication is 1 mutation for every 1 new virus that gets generated. Okay. A single human cell can probably generate a minimum of 10,000 individual viruses during 1 replication cycle. So 1 human cell, infected human cell, is generating 10,000 different variations of that initial virus. So there's an extraordinary amount of genetic mutation that occurs, and over time, what this leads to is changes in those surface proteins such that a year later they look different enough that the immune system is going to have trouble recognizing them a second time. Now, it may sound like we should just have these mutations causing new viruses all the time. Fortunately for us, most of those mutations probably are harmful to the virus. So it's not that every single one of those 10,000 mutated viruses can go off and be just as successful as the virus that caused the infection. So that's one factor that we have in our favor. Okay? And so this is why we see both pandemic and seasonal influenza. Antigenic drift, the small changes that accumulate in the outer proteins of the flu virus every year, that's the reason we see seasonal epidemics every year, whereas a completely new proteins on the surface, that's what leads to pandemic influenza. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the seasonal flu. So this is something that's probably familiar to all of us. The flu season occurs during the winter months in temperate climates like we have here in North America. In tropical climates, the flu season is less well defined, and the viruses tend to circulate at much lower levels just sort of all throughout the year. And the reasons for this are still incompletely understood. It's likely that there are a number of different factors coming into play. Perhaps the most important is probably related to changes in temperature and humidity. So the virus definitely likes to have things drier and colder, and those are the conditions we see in the wintertime here. But school calendars may also be driving a lot of this as well. So in the winter is where we have drier, colder conditions with lots of kids crammed into small rooms together. And this is data for Vermont. This is just a summary of what we saw this past season in the 2017-2018 influenza season. 2016 is here in purple. This was a bit of an outlier as far as flu seasons go because it was relatively mild. But normally what we expect to see is what we see here in green. You may not be able to read. These are weeks of the year on the bottom. So this is the first week of January. And right here, this peak is sort of the early to mid-February. So this is what we generally see in Vermont. We see influenza infections starting to come up in December, peaking in February, and then petering out through March and April. As for the United States as a whole, this is CDC data showing basically the same thing, but looking at the US as a whole. The season tends to start earlier in more southern regions. So what usually happens is the flu season starts in the southern states and then gradually works its way north. So the southern states have their peaks earlier and their seasons end earlier, and the northern states have their peaks later and end a little bit later. And then finally here, this is just data from last year's flu season again. This shows the different subtypes of the flu virus that were circulating that year. So last year, everything in red, those represent confirmed cases of H3 influenza. So H3 was the predominant strain last year. In green are the different influenza B lineages. So we had multiple influenza B lineages. And usually what we expect to see is that the influenza B cases tend to persist a little bit later. So the influenza A's disappear first, but the influenza B's will still continue to persist a little bit later. Okay. And so I want to get back to the concept of the fact that every year during the influenza season, we're going to see people die of the flu. And we track this, we usually track this by monitoring the number of pediatric deaths that occur every season. The reason we use pediatric deaths is that death in a pediatric patient with influenza is a nationally notifiable condition, whereas that's not the case for adults. So we have much more accurate numbers for pediatric deaths than adult deaths. But we use the number of pediatric deaths in a season sort of as a proxy for the severity of the season as a whole. And so last year, we had 179 children around the country die with influenza. Excuse me. This was one of the most severe influenza seasons we've had in recent memory in terms of the number of deaths that we saw. Okay. And once again, it may sound like I'm harping on a theme here, but one of the reasons is that in young and otherwise healthy patients, this phenomenon of Staph aureus pneumonia complicating influenza is a huge concern. So if we look at patients with Staph aureus pneumonia, the biggest risk factor for dying of Staph aureus pneumonia is preceding influenza. And we usually expect to see these infections, as I've mentioned several times now, in otherwise young and healthy patients. Okay, so to summarize everything that we've gone over so far in just a few key points. So number one, I hope I've impressed upon everybody that influenza is an important cause of seasonal respiratory illness that occurs in the context of yearly seasonal epidemics. Worldwide pandemics are always a possibility lurking in the background, but fortunately are rare, and influenza can be an important cause of mortality even in the otherwise young and healthy. So what to do? And now I recognize that I've been painting a rather doom and gloom type picture here with all of these grim statistics. But as I mentioned, every winter we know that we have opportunities to fight influenza. And so again, I'm reminded of another one of my favorite quotes. Benjamin Franklin once said, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." So there are lots of things that we can do to prevent influenza. So what are some of those different things? And again, this is in the context of seasonal flu. We may not be able to predict the next pandemic, but we know every winter there are opportunities to fight the flu. I think this might be the last quote that I have in my talk. I didn't realize how many quotes I had thrown in here. But so grant me the serenity, right, to accept the things I cannot change. We probably aren't going to change the fact that pandemics are going to occur every once in a while. But courage to change the things I can. So every winter there are things that we can change in terms of how we protect ourselves to prevent influenza in ourselves and our loved ones, and wisdom to know the difference. And so hopefully this will ring true with all of you, that if we know what we, meaning, and us doctors and scientists, we think we have a good idea of what the challenges are, but so far it's been very difficult to get the greater public to sort of agree on the best way forward. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So what are some of the things that we can do to help prevent infection and transmission of influenza? Well, some of these things are very mundane, but they actually do make a really big difference. So practicing good respiratory etiquette and hand hygiene, for example. So if you're sick, please use a tissue, cough or sneeze into your elbow. Sorry, that was, didn't realize you're going to have an extra sound effect there. Good hand hygiene. Wash your hands, protect yourself before you eat, wash your hands. Who knows who touched that doorknob before you? And stay home when you're sick. If you are sick, if you're unfortunate enough to be sick, please stay home, don't spread it around. But finally, what I want to get to is really where I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on, vaccination. Vaccination really is the single best way to prevent influenza infection. So who should get vaccinated? This is one of the easiest questions I ever get asked. The answer, everybody should get vaccinated, no exceptions. Everybody over the age of 6 months of age should get vaccinated for influenza every year. One of the reasons that people say they don't get vaccinated is because they hear, the flu vaccine, it doesn't even work. And this is another myth that hopefully I'd like to dispel tonight. So here's a figure that shows a summary of seasonal flu vaccine effectiveness since 2004. These numbers, they are pretty discouraging. So I apologize, this slide didn't come up very well, but what I'll read you off some numbers. So in the 2004-2005 influenza season, the vaccine was 10% effective. In 2014-2015, it was 19% effective. So when people hear numbers like that, that actually sounds pretty discouraging. It sounds as if the vaccine is not really working. So the moving average across all of these years is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% vaccine effectiveness. But one of the challenges is, so what does that actually mean when we talk about vaccine effectiveness? So here we have to understand how these measurements are actually taken. So traditionally, vaccine effectiveness has been measured using a very specific approach. There are a number of different outpatient clinics that undergo surveillance by the Centers for Disease Control. They look at all the people who come into that outpatient clinic complaining of symptoms that might be consistent with the flu. They test everybody, excuse me. They test everybody for the flu, and then amongst all the people who test positive, they look to see what percentage of people had been vaccinated versus what percentage didn't get vaccinated. And then sort of that ratio is how you flu vaccine effectiveness. So it's a very specific outcome that they're looking at. Adults who go to an outpatient clinic complaining of influenza-like symptoms, was their test positive? That's what this metric is measuring. But we really don't have, the reason I bring this up is that that really fails to adequately capture the whole picture of what influenza vaccines are actually doing. So it wasn't until 2 years ago in 2016 that we really had any comprehensive data on whether or not influenza vaccination was keeping people out of the hospital. It turns out that yes, influenza vaccine does help keep people out of the hospital if they've been vaccinated. There are lots of other effects. So if I get vaccinated and am unlucky enough to still catch the flu, what does that do to how severe the symptoms are that I feel? Or how long I'll be sick for. What is the rate of complications following vaccination? There are some better data in children looking at specific complications, but there's still a lot that we don't know just because we haven't had the right studies to answer these questions. How well does it decrease transmission to others? There are smaller scale studies that have clearly demonstrated that the benefits are much higher in specific subgroups. So for example, people with diabetes, pregnant women, there are certain populations where if you look at a very specific population, we see that the vaccines are actually working pretty darn well. And so when we hear the numbers for vaccine effectiveness, the point I'm trying to make is it fails to tell the entire picture of what flu vaccines do and how they can help. And I think that is part of the discussion that oftentimes doesn't receive enough attention. And so if we look at 2016, 2017, just another way of thinking about the numbers, it's estimated that the flu vaccine prevented over 5 million illnesses, over 2.5 million medical visits, and over 85,000 hospitalizations during one influenza season. So I don't know about you guys, but to me, those numbers aren't half bad. And this is only with a rate of vaccine coverage in the United States of less than 50%. So imagine how much better those numbers could be if everybody would just get vaccinated. So last year in 2017, only 38% of all US citizens got a flu shot prior to the peak of the flu season. Only 38%. That's pretty crummy if you ask me. Vermont tends to do slightly better than the national average, actually. If you look at going back all the way to 2010, we tend to run at about 50% coverage, whereas the US tends to run somewhere 40-45% coverage. Okay. Another myth that we hear commonly is that I didn't get the flu vaccine because my Aunt Sally's friend got the vaccine and then she got the flu and she said it was horrible, and therefore I don't want to catch the flu from the vaccine. So this is another common myth, and I'm saying here 100% certainty you cannot get the flu from the flu vaccine. And we'll get into the specific reasons why I am so certain in saying that in just a few slides. But this is a myth. You cannot get the flu from the flu vaccine. What you can get are side effects that are relatively common to any vaccination. So some aching, some redness, some swelling right at the injection site. That can happen for sure. You might feel a little bit under the weather, some headaches, some muscle aches. Those are side effects that are common with lots of different vaccines. I would be willing to bet money that if you ask somebody who had just recovered from the flu, hey, which was worse, the flu or having an achy arm for a few days, almost nobody would say, oh yeah, it was all a wash. People who really have had a rip-roaring case of flu will say there's no comparison in terms of the severity of symptoms that you experience when you have the flu versus these mild side effects from the vaccine. All right, so let's talk about the vaccines. So if this table looks confusing, it is. I'm only showing this just to demonstrate that there are lots of options for influenza vaccines now. And I would argue this is a good thing. We now have lots of different options. This is a good thing. And this is another lesson that we learned from the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. Back then, there were not a lot of vaccine options. And when the pandemic hit, everybody got caught flat-footed because suddenly we had an urgent need for more vaccines and we didn't have the capacity to produce them in a timely manner. So this is not necessarily by accident. Now we have a variety of different manufacturers and a variety of different manufacturing methods to ensure that we have a diverse pipeline of different influenza vaccines. So I'd like to talk about a few specific aspects of the vaccines. Here are the things I'd like to touch on: trivalent versus quadrivalent vaccines, inactivated versus live attenuated vaccines, and I'm going to talk a little bit about different methods of manufacture. So the first step in making any influenza vaccine is selecting the strains that are going to go into that year's vaccine. The way this works is the World Health Organization has a network of about 100 different labs, over 100 different labs, in over 100 different countries, and all they're doing is just collecting samples of influenza. They're collecting them to do surveillance to see what are the different strains that are circulating at time. Those samples are all sent to one of 5 different WHO reference labs. And based on what the WHO sees circulating in different regions of the world, once a year, they'll make a recommendation basically to the world community saying, for this year's flu season, here are the strains that we think should be included in this year's vaccine. For the United States, that data then is taken up by the FDA, and then the Food and Drug Administration will review the data and then and sort of bless the recommendation, and then the vaccine manufacturers can get to work. Okay. So for this year's flu vaccine flu season, these are the strains that are going to be included. This I've shown here the full scientific nomenclature of each of the strains that have been selected. And you see there are 4 strains listed. And most of the vaccines that are currently being made are quadrivalent strains, or quadrivalent vaccines, meaning that they have all 4 of these different influenza subtypes. Trivalent vaccines contain 3. They always will contain 2 strains of influenza A plus 1 lineage of influenza B. The quadrivalent vaccines will contain 2 influenza A's and both lineages of influenza B. Now, if you're asking yourself, isn't 4 better than 3? In general, the answer is yes, and there really has been a movement from the vaccine manufacturers that really most of the vaccines that are now being made will be quadrivalent vaccines to provide that additional protection, although some trivalent vaccines still will be available this season. And ever since H1N1, the 2 different influenza A strains that we see being included are variations of H1N1 and H3N2. Okay. So most of the vaccines that we use are what we call inactivated influenza vaccines. These are vaccines made from viruses that have been killed or from individual influenza proteins that have been purified. So no influenza vaccine that you get as a shot contains an infectious virus in it. There's nothing living in there. This is why I say with 100% certainty, you cannot catch the flu from the flu shot. There's no living virus in there to give you an infection. Okay. There are multiple ways that these vaccines can be made. The traditional method is using an egg-based culture method, and then there are 2 newer methods known as a cell culture-based method and a recombinant protein-based method. So the egg-based influenza vaccines, these are the old standby. This is the tried and true. The way this works is that you get the circulating strain of influenza that's going to be included in that year's vaccine. This has to be mixed with what's known as a master strain. This is a strain of flu that's been highly adapted to grow efficiently in eggs. And what they have to do is they need to get this virus to recombine with this one such that you get a recombinant or a reassorted virus that's mostly made up of the virus that grows well in eggs, but that has the 2 outer proteins from the virus strain that you want to include in the vaccine. So once you have that change accomplished, then this gets propagated in eggs, harvested, and then eventually it's inactivated, meaning all the virus is killed, and then it can either be split up or partially purified, meaning they're just pulling out, what they're really trying to do is they're trying to pull out the outer proteins, once again, the all-important H and N proteins, and that's what's going into the actual vaccines. So most of the vaccines still utilize this method. The disadvantages is that there's a long production time. So starting from strain selection, which usually occurs sometime in January, it's going to be 10 or 11 months using this method until you get vaccine out on the shelves. The other challenge is that because the virus has to undergo that recombination, that during the process of growing in eggs, those proteins do undergo modification. So the final proteins that you end up with in the vaccine might not necessarily be as close of a match as what you had hoped for when you were starting at the beginning. Okay. I'll skip this slide. So because of that, for those 2 reasons, there have been these newer technologies developed. So the cell culture-based vaccine, it's basically the exact same idea as using eggs, but instead of growing the virus in eggs, the viruses are grown in mammalian cells. Specifically, they're cells taken from the kidneys of dogs. For whatever reason, that particular cell type grows influenza very well. And the advantage is that it takes a lot less space. You can grow a lot more virus in a much smaller volume. Eggs, they all, a whole big batch of eggs, it just takes a lot of space. So this is a way to more efficiently make more vaccine. Similarly, a recombinant influenza vaccine is now available. This utilizes genetic engineering. So the way this works is that you actually take insect cells, you take an insect virus, and what you can do is you can insert the genetic instructions for that insect virus to actually make the influenza hemagglutinin protein. So you take that genetically modified insect virus, infect a batch of insect cells, and as that infection goes forward, those cells start cranking out influenza hemagglutinin proteins, and then you can capture those proteins and purify them and get them into a vaccine. And again, this is a much faster and more scalable way of making vaccines compared to eggs. All right, and I have just a few more slides here. The live attenuated vaccine. So this is the one flu vaccine that does contain living virus. It's delivered as a nasal spray into each nostril. It's living but weakened virus. And specifically, the way that this virus has been weakened is that it's been modified such that it can only grow at colder temperatures. Specifically, the colder temperature that you see at the tip of the nose. Okay? So it gets sprayed into the nose. It can survive and replicate right at the tip of the nose. But if it tries to make it into the body and hits a portion of the body that's at a healthy core temperature of 98.6, then it dies because it can't survive at the normal core temperature. It can only survive at that cold temperature at the tip of the nose. Okay. The last 2 years, there was some concern about how well this vaccine was working, so it was not included in the vaccine recommendations. This year, due to some slight changes in the manufacturing process, they do believe that this will be an acceptable option again. Okay. So at the end of the day, there are multiple options for multiple different scenarios, but the important thing to recognize is getting any influenza vaccine. Any one you can get is better than no vaccine at all, and it's certainly more important than trying to decide which is the exact type that's best for you. Just do it, please. Get your flu shot this year. Okay. One of the most sobering statistics that I've ever come across when it comes to flu vaccines is this one. In children who die of influenza, 80% of them occur in kids who weren't vaccinated. And so there are many things that we see in medicine that are tragic, but perhaps there's nothing more tragic than the death of a child that could have been prevented. And so I'd be willing to bet that if you ask any parent who was unfortunate enough to lose a child in this manner, if you ask them, if you could go back in time and get your kid that flu shot, would you have done it then? I'd be shocked if we would find any parent who will still say, no, I think it was probably a good idea not to vaccinate. Okay, so finally, my last couple of slides. I've been talking about the need for a yearly flu shot every winter when the influenza season hits. This is the only vaccine where we need to do this, right? Why can't we just have one vaccine, you just get it once, and then you're protected for the rest of your life against all forms of influenza? Why is it that this can't be the way that we do it? So that concept is known as a universal influenza vaccine, and that's one of the holy grails in all of medical science right now. And I put this quote up here because sometimes our efforts at doing this might make us feel just like these guys are sort of bumbling around across the English countryside. So rest assured, people are hard at work trying to develop a universal influenza vaccine. It's based on the idea that even though those surface proteins are constantly changing, which is why we get antigenic drift and seasonal influenza epidemics, there's just got to be some parts of the virus that don't change, right? There's just got to be some parts of the virus that are conserved. And it turns out that there are a number of parts of the virus that are conserved and don't appear to change year to year. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip ahead to this figure. So this is a structure of the hemagglutinin protein molecule. And what you'll see is that the head region is where all the action occurs. This is where all of the where the different mutations that occur in the H types, that's where it's all occurring. This stalked region that anchors that molecule to the surface of the virus, it turns out this stalked region actually doesn't really change. The way I like to picture this, again, thinking about my kids, it's like a Mr. Potato Head. You have a potato, but the potato is not the exciting part. The exciting part is all the different parts that you can put on top, right? Unfortunately, the human immune system tends to view it the same way. When the human immune system sees this molecule, it goes nuts playing around with this region up here and completely ignores what's going on down here. So if we're going to make a universal influenza vaccine that's designed on getting the body to attack this portion of the virus, we're going to have to do something that nature itself hasn't really figured out a way to do. And so there are multiple different groups working on multiple different methods for how to get this to work. But unfortunately, nobody has come up with a way that looks promising enough that we're anywhere close to having any type of human studies or human candidate vaccine. So people are hard at work and on developing this, but it's going to be some time, I think, before we're can even talk about whether it's on the horizon or not. So to wrap up, I hope I've impressed upon you all that influenza, it's a serious public health problem in all populations of the globe. Yearly epidemics interspersed with rare pandemics. We should get used to it. Best way to protect yourself and loved ones is a yearly flu shot, which are safe and effective, even if not as effective as we'd like. They definitely do save lives. If you are interested in learning more on your own, I highly recommend the CDC influenza website. It is an absolute treasure trove of information about influenza, and they have it separated into different categories for scientists, for doctors, and for members of the public who are just interested in learning a little bit more about the flu. So with that, I will stop. Thank you very much for your attention. This was a lot of fun, and I'd be happy to take questions.
So we will be bringing around microphones to folks that are raising their hands. We'll try to do first come, first serve. Please do not start asking a question unless you have a microphone in your hand.
Hi. I think everyone here is going to want to know this. If there's the different types of flu vaccines, how do we determine when we go to the pharmacy which one we're getting? Should we ask for a different one?
So I think in general, so the first place to start would be with your physician. So not every place is going to have every type of vaccine, which is why I say really the best vaccine is whichever one is available to you. And so the best place to start if you are curious about learning more about the different types would be your physician, because there are some nuances about the different types. So some are approved just for certain age groups, et cetera. So that would be my recommendation. At the end of the day, even if you're getting immunized, say at a pharmacy or what have you, I really wouldn't think too long and hard about what type of vaccine they're giving. Just as long as the flu shot, it's going to be good enough.
What are the characteristics of people who appear to be resistant to the flu? There must be some subgroups in the world.
There probably are. That's a great question. So what are the characteristics of people who are resistant to the flu? It's a great question. I don't know that we really know enough about it. It could be that people who appear to be resistant to the flu just happen to be incredibly lucky, and they actually are just as susceptible as anybody else, but just by chance, they just have had the good fortune of not catching it, and definitely we see that happen. There are a number of different infections where we know that there are some genetic characteristics, or genetic. What's the best way to put it? There are some things. There are some genetically determined characteristics that might make people resistant to some infections and not the other. But we really don't have a good handle on on what those are for flu and whether any of that information really is meaningful from a public health standpoint.
How much room for variation is there between different strains of influenza that have the same HN profile?
So that's a great question. I'm not sure. So you're saying among strains that have the same HNN,
right.
HNN types, what's the sort of potential variability within those different types?
Yeah, so if there's like a H1N1 strain that infects everyone and then everyone becomes immune to it, then another H1N1 strain infects that they're not immune to anymore. There's got to be some difference.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that I have a good way of being able to sort of quantitate it. I mean, what we know is that there's quite a bit of variation, and we see it every year. So for example, the strain of H1N1 that we'll see this year is still going to be different enough from the strain of H1N1 that we saw last year, that even if you got the flu last year, you're probably still going to be susceptible to the new one this year. So, I don't know that I can put necessarily like a number to it, but what we just see naturally is that there's more than enough variation that even just in the context of within a single year, we can have enough of a difference that we're going to have new epidemics.
There's a lot of publicity about pneumonia vaccines right now. Are they effective against the kind of pneumonias you'd pick up associated with the flu?
So the pneumonia vaccines. So the pneumonia vaccines that are available. Generally, it is a vaccine targeting Streptococcus pneumoniae. It is the most common cause of pneumonia, not only in the setting of influenza. So absolutely, if you're due for your pneumonia vaccine, I highly encourage you to get it, because that will help protect you not only in the setting of flu, but that's a bacteria that can cause pneumonia, any time of the year. Will probably know, just based on my talk and the fact that I work at the UVM Vaccine Testing Center, I'm a fan of vaccines, and I think that that absolutely it will be helpful. Unfortunately, there is not a vaccine against Staph aureus, which is the other major bacteria that we see causing pneumonia in the setting of flu. Again, there are a lot of scientists hard at work at trying to see if we can make a vaccine for that, but so far we don't have anything.
Would you speak, please, about more severe adverse reactions, for example, that causes nerve damage like demyelination and muscle atrophy?
Okay. Yeah. So one of the concerns with with influenza vaccine has been potential neurologic complications, and in particular, there's one side effect that oftentimes is discussed in the context of influenza vaccine, and that's something called Guillain-Barré syndrome. Guillain-Barré syndrome is a demyelinating condition where it most commonly happens in the aftermath of infections, where what happens is you get a ascending paralysis. So starting from the feet moving up, you can get a temporary paralysis. Usually, people will recover from that just fine, although if it gets high enough, it can involve the muscles that you use to breathe, and in that case, it can be dangerous. But usually, with supportive care and treatment, that condition, most people will recover from it. The reason this comes up as a concern with flu vaccines is that it does look like there was 1 year, I believe it was 1968. There was, for whatever reason, there was 1 year and 1 year only where it did look like the flu vaccines that were being given that year was associated with a slightly higher risk of that condition, Guillain-Barré syndrome. And so this now has persisted as a potential, as a fear, like, are we going to see more Guillain-Barré? So all of the data that we have been able to generate has indicated that, yes, there probably was something that happened during that one specific year, but that signal has never been seen since in all the years that have followed. And so because of that, at least right now, in my opinion, especially now with the different manufacturing techniques that are used, I don't believe that there's any increased risk for Guillain-Barré syndrome due to influenza vaccine. The ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practice, they do have, as one of their precautions for influenza vaccine, anybody who's had Guillain-Barré within 6 weeks of having a prior vaccine dose. That is one very small group of people in which they potentially say maybe hold off on vaccinating those folks just in case. But the bulk of all the evidence ever since the 1960s on has been that there hasn't really been much in the way of increased risk for neurologic complications with the influenza vaccine. The one I will mention specific to children is if you give influenza shots in combination with certain other vaccines, there is a very, very slight increased risk of febrile seizure. So febrile seizures are, just like it sounds, seizures that children have in the setting of fever. These are generally completely self-limited. They cause no harm. It's different from epilepsy or seizure disorder where somebody has chronic seizures. Usually the most common reason for febrile seizures in a kid is some type of viral infection, so a cold or ear infection or something like that. So there's a very slightly increased risk for febrile seizures in certain children. But again, that's, of all the sort of vaccine side effects out there, that's in the grand scheme of things a rather innocuous one at the end of the day.
So I noticed in some of the vaccines in that chart that some of them had mercury content in them, and I was wondering if there was a reason for that, or if there were any adverse effects that were associated with those vaccines and not with others.
Yeah, so in the US vaccine supply, the only vaccines in the US vaccine supply that have even any hint of mercury-based preservative is in the multi-dose vial flu vaccines. So those are the ones where the clinic or providers are going into the same vial multiple times. The reason that's the case is that that's the only way to prevent somebody's going into that vial multiple times. There's always a risk for some type of contamination to get in, and those are there to act as a preservative to prevent against contamination. So there are very small quantities of thimerosal preservative in certain multi-dose vials. It's not all flu vaccines. They're only specific multi-dose vials. And whether or not thimerosal causes any type of adverse effects, the data on this are about as definitive as you can get. There's never been any evidence that a thimerosal-based preservative causes any type of adverse effect when given in the context of vaccines.
I have a question. I think someone asked the question as to which type of vaccine I take, or if the doctor, you said that your physician needs to let you know which one. However, if someone doesn't know about it and goes to a clinic and is allergic to eggs and receives the egg-based vaccine, what are the consequences of that?
Okay, so that's a great question. So in the past, there has been concern that people who have an egg allergy may need to exercise additional precaution when getting a flu vaccine because of the manufacturing process. So all of the cumulative evidence that we have now indicates that, in fact, for people, unless they have really severe egg allergy, people with mild allergies to eggs can safely be vaccinated really in any type of setting. The number of egg-related side effects that have occurred based on flu vaccine really is quite low. And so the current recommendation is anybody with an egg allergy can and should be safely vaccinated with any of the available vaccine types. If somebody has a severe egg allergy, like anaphylaxis, anaphylactic shock, something like that, as a result of exposure to eggs, that is not a contraindication anymore to getting the flu vaccine. But for those people who have the most severe reactions, it's just recommended that they actually go to a medical center for their vaccination. So rather than getting it done in a pharmacy setting, or like a flu clinic, going to their doctor's office to get that shot. For those who are really worried about it, based on past experience with eggs, the recombinant protein-based vaccines and the cell-based vaccines, there's no eggs at all in those manufacturing processes. But really at the end of the day, there was a lot of fear about whether egg allergic individuals can get flu shots, and all of our experience now has demonstrated that it is in fact safe for people who are allergic to eggs to get the flu shot.
Thank you.
So we know that Zika virus gets in to the womb and affects babies in the womb. I think measles do too. Does the influenza virus get into the womb? And I've read studies that say that, for instance, bipolar, if you look when bipolar people are born, they're born in flu season. Could there be some other adverse effects, and should pregnant women get the influenza virus, influenza vaccine?
Absolutely. So I'll start with the last question. Absolutely, pregnant women should make sure they have their flu shot. So pregnancy is in fact one of the highest risk scenarios in which somebody can get influenza, both to the mother and the fetus. And it's less of a concern that the virus itself is causing an infection in the womb to the baby. But what tends to happen is that for a number of reasons that are really still incompletely understood, pregnant women are much more susceptible to just getting much more severe illness, and that stress on the body could put their fetus at risk. And there are a number of different reasons why we think that might be the case. So for example, pregnancy is considered a relatively immunotolerant condition. The body has, the pregnant female has a new organism growing inside her, and her immune system needs to recognize this is not something I want to attack, this is something I want to preserve and protect. And because of that, pregnant women's immune responses across the board just tend to get toned down. And part of the thought is maybe that's why when somebody who's pregnant does get the flu, maybe that's one of the reasons why they can get so sick with it. Absolutely, all pregnant women during the flu season absolutely should make sure that they're getting their flu shots to protect themselves and their babies.
Can you explain about the senior citizen strength flu shot for after age 66, and what is it? How is it different? Is it matter if you get the younger person's one if you're?
Yeah. So the vaccine you're referring to, I believe, is the high dose influenza vaccine. So when the immune system reaches a certain age, it's known that the ability for the immune system to respond tends to diminish. And so this is a phenomenon known as immune senescence. And so in patients older than 65, it's recognized, and this isn't just for influenza, it's with lots of other vaccines, that the response to it isn't as good as it would have been 10 years earlier, 20 years earlier. So one of the approaches that has been taken is increasing the amount of the vaccine antigen that's being delivered. So literally, the idea is that more is better. So it's a higher dosage of the influenza proteins that are contained in the vaccine. And so I definitely do think there's a rationale for it, and I definitely think that it makes sense for individuals who are 65 or older to receive a high-dose influenza vaccine. There may be a slightly increased risk of some of those mild side effects, so more achiness, that sort of thing. It doesn't mean that if you get the regular flu vaccine that's wrong or that's bad. It's just that the high-dose vaccine, if you're older than 65, will sort of maximize the amount of possible protection that you could get.
Hi, I just wanted to know why Hi, I wanted to know why we don't have a mandatory
vaccination, I know the country doesn't want this to be forced on them, but if there was a pandemic, the government would, of course, have to do that. Thank you.
So why don't we have mandatory vaccination? Yeah, I mean, that's a that's a pretty prickly question. You know, at the end of the day, you know, this being America, you know, I think, you know, individual rights and choices are held in very high regard, and so, you know, I think from a political standpoint and from a public health perspective, I do think it gets a little bit problematic if we start pushing for mandatory vaccination. Personally, I think that the data are so overwhelming that demonstrate how great vaccines work in terms of protecting us and our loved ones, that to me it's still, you know, a little bit astonishing that that so many people don't get vaccinated or refuse to get vaccinated. Now, there are certain subgroups of the population for which mandatory vaccination is the rule. So, example, if you're in the military, you're going to get whatever vaccines they tell you you're going to get. If you are a health worker, this is a very controversial topic, but there have been many hospital centers and health settings that say, if you work in my hospital, if you're a doctor, if you're a nurse, if you're a laboratory technician, you get your flu shot or you find another job. Personally, I don't get to make those decisions, but I do think that medical professionals sort of have that responsibility to really promote vaccination amongst all of us, because I think that really is the best way that we have to protect us, and particularly our loved ones, from getting sick.
I was told by a local healthcare provider just this week that vaccine for 65 and year people and older is not going to be available this year. Is that correct?
Well, that is a great question. I actually will confess I don't know the answer to that. The reason I don't know the answer to that is I'm a practicing pediatrician, so I actually never think about you know, things that are only indicated for individuals 65 or older. So if that is the case, I am not aware of it, but that doesn't mean that might not be the case. So I'm sorry, I don't have a definite answer for you there.
That's all you know.
Okay.
All right, and we have time for one more question.
Let me see if I understand this right. You get the vaccine, which is a little bit of the flu. It's put into your body, it's inactivated somehow, and it's your body's own immune system that builds up the defense against the flu.
Correct.
So that's very similar to the way, let's say, Keytruda works in cancer, where it affects the receptors so that the cancer cells can't eliminate the body's immune system from attaching to the cancer cells.
Okay.
And the body's immune system then is allowed to kill the cancer cells. So really a lot of this vaccine and other medicines are really simply allowing the body's own immune system to be effective. Is
Correct.
that right? True?
Yes, and so I didn't include, I had contemplated including just a very basic sort of overview of the, you know, how vaccines work and the overall concept, but that's exactly right. So when you give a vaccine, the idea is to get the body's immune system stimulated, and
You're giving it an antigen which
yeah.
the body will recognize,
right.
and the body's own immune system is dealing with that vaccine that gave you, plus anything else that comes.
Correct.
That's similar to that.
Correct. Yep. So it's giving the body a head start. So when, if the body then encounters the flu, it already has everything it needs ready to go to attack it and say, sorry, you're not going to set up shop here. And so that's exactly what vaccines are designed to do.
The body is really protecting itself.
Yeah.
And that's what the medicine or the vaccine is allowing it
Yes.
to do.
Yes, correct.
All right, let's give Dr. Lee a hand. Thank him for his presentation. Thanks so much for coming tonight. We have 2 more community medical school lectures this fall. The next one is on October 2nd. It's how cannabis affects the body and the brain. The presentation will be given by Dr. Karen Lounsbury and Dr. Peter Jackson, and we hope to see you then.